Perhaps some of you saw or read David Brooks' op-ed piece in today's New York Times with the title, "The Cure for What Ails Our Democracy." And in it, he brings forward an idea associated with the great British philosopher Isaiah Berlin, the idea of what he calls and what Berlin calls value pluralism, by which Berlin means good ideas on a variety of topics that don't fit neatly together and that are in tension with one another. And Berlin himself lists several of these tensions. We might call them dyads, two values in opposition or in tension with one another. And I quote, "For example, we may want to use government to make society more equal, but if we do, we'll have to expand state power so much that it will impinge on some people's freedom, which is a good we also believe in." And there are other tensions: loyalty to a particular community versus universal solidarity with all humankind, respect for authority versus individual autonomy, social progress versus social stability, the desire to be enmeshed in a community versus the desire to have the personal space to do what you desire, the desire to stand out versus the desire to fit in, the cry for justice versus the cry for mercy. Now, each of these dyads, each of these tensions, reflect the fact that we value both sides of the tension, say loyalty to a particular community and universal solidarity with all of humankind. And so it's not just a matter of choosing A or B, one alternative or the other, but because we recognize the value of both A and B. And so the challenge is to find a balance between the two. And there is no absolute decision procedure that will tell us how to do it. The decision, the balance, relies on the particularities of the situation and the experience we have gained over a number of years. So we have to find ways to embrace both and to be able to talk civilly with those who choose the value different from the one we have favored. As it happens, we have an example of this sort of tension to which Brooks, in the name of Berlin, calls our attention this morning. We have an example of this kind of tension between the very first verses of this week's Torah portion, Terumah, and the first verses of the portion that we will read 2 weeks from now. Here are those two verses. First, from this week's Torah portion. "The Lord spoke to Moses, 'Tell the Israelite people to bring me gifts. You shall accept gifts for me.'" This is for the building of the tabernacle. "You shall accept gifts for me from every person whose heart so moves him." In other words, the contributions to the building and the furnishing of the Mishkan, the tabernacle, are to be voluntary from those whose heart so moves them. But at the beginning of the Torah portion 2 weeks from now, we read something quite at odds with that statement. When you take a census of the Israelite people according to their enrollment, each person shall pay. Everyone who is entered in the records shall pay a half shekel by weight, and you shall assign it to the service of the tent of meeting. In other words, in this passage, donations for the sanctuary are obligatory. So which is it, voluntary or obligatory? And the answer would seem to be both, which makes sense, because both have value. We, of course, want people to want to make donations that they make. Voluntary donations are purer, and they are a result of the donor's acceptance of the value of the enterprise or the institution to which he or she is voluntarily contributing. But let's face it, we can't count on voluntary giving because the institutions can't survive if we wait for a sufficient number of people to want to give, and to want to give in a way that really helps. In any event, a strong argument can be made for requiring people to pay, to donate. And these are what we might call the justified claims of the community. And here I want to refer briefly to one of Plato's early dialogues, the Crito, in which we find Socrates, having been convicted of injustice, is now waiting in jail in order for the moment when he is going to have to drink the hemlock. And his friends come to him and they plead with him to escape on the basis that the verdict was unjust and his life and contributions are still important to the community. Flee from an unjust conviction. And Socrates says no, it would be wrong to flee. Why? For a variety of reasons. One of which is he has lived all his life in Athens and has benefited from the structure and values of the community. Having stayed there and having received benefits, he cannot now, for his own individual purposes, flee the community. In other words, when we give our time and our presence to a community, that creates obligations from us to that community. And so giving back is no longer exclusively voluntary, but we have, by our very endurance in the community, created for us an obligation to that community. And so our communities, the communities in which we have lived and from which we have benefited, these communities can require, or let's be realistic, they can try to require, they can create a sense, a cultural sense of obligation, precisely because we have benefited from our communities. So it's both. And communities and institutions need to find a way to accommodate both obligation and free will offerings. And so briefly, I want to look as an example at the Jewish view of charity, of tzedakah. On the one hand, according to our tradition, every Jewish community is required to have a tzedakah charity organization to which all the inhabitants of the town are obligated to contribute according to their means. In other words, tzedakah is obligatory on everyone, for otherwise the community and their needs cannot be met. And it may interest you to know that even the poor have an obligation to contribute to tzedakah from the monies they have received. Even the poor are benefiting from the community and have an obligation. And let's think about this. As a byproduct of the requirement of the poor to give tzedakah, they accrue the dignity of not just being a recipient, but of being a donor. On the other hand, Maimonides, who does believe that we're obligated to give charity, also makes a kind of case for emphasizing the voluntary impulse. He says that it is better to give in successive stages rather than all at once, because by stages, we accrue a greater effect on our character than one huge donation all of once will have on us. We can, of course, be carried away by our feelings of extreme generosity, but the momentum of that enthusiasm can wane. That is, the voluntary impulse may be transient if it only is expressed at one moment. But by giving in stages, we might be able to create a habit and thereby create something of a character disposition to give, and therefore create the impulse for voluntarily contributing to the community. And what has Maimonides accomplished here? Voluntarism within the context of obligation. And in Maimonides' famous 8 degrees of giving, Maimonides allows for free choice, even though there is, of course, for him a hierarchy as to how, in what way, the giver will give. And though a certain town high court in the early rabbinic period decreed a limit on giving, after all, we have no obligation to give so much that it begins to hurt us. We are our own nearest neighbor. No one has an obligation to impoverish him or herself. But another court opined that really there is no limit on giving, that the free will impulse can express itself as it will. Moreover, the rabbis suggest that ideally a person should give cheerfully, generously, and out of the goodness of his or her heart. This is the best kind of giving. And so the Jewish tradition tries to strike a balance between the obligatory and the voluntary, the duty to oneself and one's family, and the duty to the community, and especially the poor of the community. And so as Brooks writes, life confronts us with many examples of what he calls value pluralism, in which two competing values, both worthy, vie for our attention and for our commitment. We find several examples of this in the Torah. We think of Abraham. And our Exodus portions, this week's and 2 weeks from now, offer but one striking example of that tension. And this suggests something further, that the Torah, far from being either simplistic or dogmatic, recognizes the inevitability of conflict between complementary values, because life is complex, and the answers to the big questions are never fully straightforward or simple. And so, in order to keep a tradition vibrant and realistic and relevant and idealistic, that tradition must eschew dogmatism and cultivate conversation, dialogue, and not simply assertion, and the humility to recognize that my values are not the only values, and that on issues that matter, complementary commitments exist, and the tensions will inevitably arise. These are the premises of fundamental and worthwhile conversation. To quote Brooks again, the values pluralist never believes that he or she is in possession of the very truth of things, and that all others live in error. The pluralist is slow to assert certainty, knowing that even those people who strenuously denounce him are probably partially right. We may believe that social progress is the most important imperative, but we should also recognize the claims of social stability. We may believe in the overriding importance of universal solidarity with all of humankind, but we should also recognize the important claims of our particular communities. We may believe that charity should be a matter of individual choice, but we should also recognize the claims of the community and the institutions who serve and may be called upon to serve the individual. Values pluralism recognizes the existence of values, but to borrow from Brooks with a few of my alterations, all those values do not and cannot fit together in, and here's a felicitous phrase, all these values do not and cannot fit together in one frictionless whole.